The construction site loomed against the afternoon sky, all steel beams and half-finished concrete. He'd told her they should take the safer route around it, but she'd insisted on the shortcut. She was always in a hurry, always looking for the fastest path to wherever they needed to be. That particular Tuesday, they were running late for their anniversary dinner, 5 years of marriage, and he'd made reservations at the upscale restaurant where he'd proposed. The sound came first. A metallic groan that seemed to stretch across the entire universe, followed by shouting from somewhere above. He looked up and saw it, a massive steel beam, dislodged from its moorings, swinging down like the hand of an angry god. The safety netting had failed. Everything moved in slow motion and impossibly fast at the same time. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, her mouth forming the beginning of a scream that hadn't yet found its voice. He didn't think. There wasn't time to think. His body moved on pure instinct, fueled by 5 years of love and a lifetime of choosing her above everything else. He launched himself forward, his hands connecting with her shoulders, shoving her with every ounce of strength he possessed. She flew backward, stumbling but safe. The beam caught him across his lower back with the force of a freight train. The impact drove him to the ground, and he heard something crack, several somethings, like branches breaking in a storm. Then came the pain, white-hot and all-consuming, radiating from his spine outward until his entire world was nothing but agony. He remembered her screaming. He remembered the sirens. He remembered the paramedics' faces growing grave as they carefully, so carefully, lifted him onto the stretcher. What he remembered most clearly was her hand holding his, her tears falling on his face, her voice promising over and over, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I love you. I'm here." The hospital became his new reality. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, doctors with carefully neutral expressions delivering carefully worded explanations. The spinal cord injury was severe. T12 and L1 vertebrae, they said, pointing to x-rays that meant nothing to him but everything about his future. Paralyzed from the waist down. Possibly permanent. They'd know more after the swelling decreased, after surgery, after rehabilitation. So many arteries, stretching into a future he couldn't recognize. She visited every day at first. She held his hand during the surgery, was there when he woke up. She helped the nurses adjust his position, brought him books and his laptop, tried to smile when the physical therapist explained the long road ahead. But he could see something changing in her eyes. Where there had been love, he began to see something else. Pity, yes, but also something darker. Resentment? Fear? The slow dawning of a future she hadn't signed up for? The rehabilitation facility was supposed to be temporary, but days stretched into weeks. He threw himself into physical therapy with desperate determination, pushing his upper body until his arms trembled with exhaustion. The therapists praised his work ethic. Other patients looked to him as inspiration. But she came less frequently. First every other day, then twice a week, then just weekends. "I'm trying," she said one Saturday, and he heard the exhaustion in her voice. "I'm working extra shifts to cover the medical bills. The insurance doesn't cover everything. I'm doing my best." He believed her because he needed to. Because the alternative, that she was pulling away, that saving her life had cost him hers and her love, was too devastating to contemplate. He focused on getting better, on proving the doctors wrong, on becoming the man she'd married again. If he could just walk, he thought, everything would be okay. If he could just recover enough to work again, to take care of her the way he always had, she'd come back. The woman who'd promised she wasn't going anywhere would remember those words. He didn't know that across town, at the corporate fundraiser she'd mentioned attending, she was meeting someone new. Someone whose legs worked perfectly. Someone whose bank account had more zeros than he'd seen in his entire life. Someone who represented everything she'd convinced herself she wanted, everything she'd felt slipping away in those hospital corridors. The countdown to his new reality had already begun. The divorce papers arrived by courier, processed with remarkable efficiency, no doubt expedited by Jonathan's expensive attorneys. He signed them without reading the details, his signature a slash of finality across the bottom of pages that reduced 5 years of marriage to legal boilerplate. She could have the dishes, the furniture, the wedding china they'd never used. He wanted none of it. Everything from their life together was contaminated now, tainted by her betrayal. But he kept the laptop. That battered machine became his lifeline, his connection to a world beyond these rehabilitation center walls. Late at night, when pain and phantom sensations made sleep impossible, he taught himself everything he could about digital entrepreneurship. If his body was broken, his mind was sharper than ever, honed by months of forced stillness and furious determination. His physical therapist, a tough woman named Rita who took no excuses and offered no pity, noticed the change in him. "You're different," she observed during one particularly grueling session. He was hauling himself along the parallel bars, arms trembling with effort, sweat pouring down his face. Angry different. That can be good or bad. Good, he grunted, forcing himself another agonizing foot forward. I'm channeling it. Into what? Everything. And he was. The rage, the betrayal, the bone-deep humiliation of being abandoned in his lowest moment, all of it became fuel. He pushed harder in therapy, worked longer on his business plans, refused to accept limitations that others tried to impose. When doctors cautioned him against overexertion, he smiled politely and ignored them. When other patients complained about their progress, he buried himself deeper in rehabilitation exercises and market research. His online business started small, consulting work he could do entirely from his laptop, leveraging the project management experience from his old career. His first client paid him $800 for 3 weeks of work. It wasn't much, but it was his. Money he'd earned not despite his disability but simply by being good at what he did. That first payment felt like vindication, like proof of concept for the life he was building. 6 months after she left, he moved into an accessible studio apartment. It was small, sparse, but it was independence. No more rehabilitation center, no more institutional meals, no more pitying looks from nurses who'd witnessed his abandonment. Just him, his wheelchair, his laptop, and a future that was finally, terrifyingly his own. The business grew faster than he'd anticipated. Word spread in the digital nomad community about the consultant who delivered exceptional results, never missed deadlines, and charged reasonable rates. His client roster expanded from 1 to 5 to 15. He hired a virtual assistant, then another. Revenue climbed from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands monthly. But he never stopped the physical therapy. Every morning, before opening his laptop, he spent 2 hours working his body. Upper body strength came easily. Months of wheelchair use had given him shoulders and arms like a swimmer. But he focused obsessively on his core, on the damaged areas, on microscopic improvements that doctors said might be imaginary. He documented everything, tracking sensation and movement with scientific precision. 14 months after the accident, during a routine therapy session, his right big toe moved. Just a twitch, barely visible, possibly a spasm. Rita saw it and went very still. Do that again. He concentrated, willing every ounce of focus into that toe. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. Then, just as he was about to give up, movement. Definite, unmistakable movement. Rita's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed steady. We have work to do. The work was excruciating. Relearning movement, fighting through pain that defied description, celebrating victories measured in millimeters. He could wiggle toes, then flex ankles, then, impossibly, generate weak contractions in his quadriceps. The doctors called it remarkable, unprecedented, miraculous. He called it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, just another day of refusing to accept what others decided was his ceiling. His business passed 6 figures in annual revenue. Then 7. He hired a small team of remote workers, diversified into digital products, launched an online course teaching others how to build location-independent careers. The income that had seemed impossible from a wheelchair exceeded what he'd made in his old corporate job. Success became its own form of therapy, each milestone a middle finger to everyone who'd counted him out. 2 years after the accident, he took his first steps. They were ugly, painful, dependent on a walker and Rita's steadying hands. He made it 6 feet before exhaustion forced him back into the wheelchair. But those 6 feet might as well have been 6 miles. He'd walked. His legs, which doctors had called permanently paralyzed, had carried his weight. He didn't tell anyone outside his therapy team. Not his distant family, not his former friends, and certainly not her. This victory was his alone, a secret resurrection that owed nothing to anyone's belief or support. Every week, the distance increased. 6 feet became 12, then 20, then the length of the therapy room. The walker gave way to crutches, then to a cane, then to nothing but his own 2 legs, shaky but functional, damaged but working. 3 years after she'd left him in that rehabilitation center, he walked unassisted into his accountant's office to discuss his company's tax strategy for breaking 8 figures in revenue. The accountant, who'd never known him as anything but a successful entrepreneur, had no idea he was looking at a man who'd been written off as permanently disabled. That night, alone in an apartment that had grown from a studio to a spacious loft, he allowed himself to wonder about her. Where was she? Was she happy with her wealthy man? Did she ever think about the husband she'd abandoned? Did she know that the broken man she'd left behind had built something extraordinary from the rubble of his life? He'd find out soon enough. The universe, he was learning, had a wicked sense of irony. 3 months into his rehabilitation, she stopped wearing her wedding ring. He noticed it immediately but said nothing, hoping he was reading too much into it. Maybe she'd simply taken it off to apply lotion. Maybe it was being resized. Maybe. The word became a prayer he whispered to himself in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come, when phantom sensations tortured his useless legs, when the future loomed like a vast, unknowable abyss. The truth arrived on a Thursday evening. She came to the facility earlier than usual, her makeup too perfect, her outfit too expensive, not the scrub she wore for her extra nursing shifts. She sat in the visitor's chair, the same one she'd occupied dozens of times before, but this time she perched on its edge like a bird ready for flight. "We need to talk," she said, and those 4 words contained entire lifetimes of endings. His hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests, knuckles going white. "Okay." She couldn't meet his eyes. She stared at her hands, at the window, at the ceiling, anywhere but at him. "I can't do this anymore. I thought I could, but I can't. It's too hard. Everything's too hard. The bills, the hospital visits, the uncertainty. I'm drowning, and I need," her voice cracked. "I need to save myself." "I'm getting better," he said, hating the pleading note in his voice. "The therapists say I'm making remarkable progress. In a few months, I might be able to. I met someone." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything they'd built together. "His name is Jonathan. He's successful, stable. He can give me the life I thought we'd have. The life we were supposed to have before." She gestured vaguely at his wheelchair, at his legs, at the catastrophic moment when he'd saved her life and lost his own. The pain that lanced through him had nothing to do with his injury. "Before I saved your life. That's not fair." "Fair?" He laughed, a bitter sound he barely recognized. "You want to talk about fair? I pushed you out of the way. That beam was meant for you. And now you're leaving me because I took the hit instead." Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move him anymore. "I know. God, I know how terrible this is. I know what you sacrificed. But I can't spend the rest of my life being grateful. I can't build a marriage on guilt and obligation. Jonathan doesn't make me feel guilty. He makes me feel whole." He finished for her. "Because I'm not whole anymore, is that it? Because I'm broken now." "You're not broken. That's not what I meant." But her eyes said otherwise. Her eyes said he was exactly as broken as he felt, that she'd already mourned the man she'd married and moved on to someone new, someone whose spine worked correctly, whose future didn't involve accessible parking and wheelchair ramps and a lifetime of physical therapy that might lead nowhere. She stood, and he noticed she'd already removed everything personal from her purse that might remind her of him. The keychain with their photo, the lucky charm he'd bought her in Vegas, all the tiny artifacts of their shared life. She'd come prepared to make this clean, surgical, final. "I've talked to a lawyer," she said quietly. "I'm not going to make this difficult. You can keep the apartment. I'll take my things this weekend while you're in therapy. I'll continue helping with the medical bills until you're back on your feet." She caught herself, winced at the unintentional cruelty. Until you're stable. I'm not a monster. Aren't you? He didn't raise his voice. Somehow that made it worse. I took a steel beam for you. I gave you my legs, my career, my future. And you're leaving me for a man with better credit score. I'm sorry. She moved toward the door, each step an act of abandonment. I know you probably hate me. Maybe you should. But I can't sacrifice my whole life because you sacrificed yours. I didn't ask you to push me. I never asked for any of this. After she left, he sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. The evening nurse found him there hours later, staring at nothing, his face dry of tears because he'd moved beyond crying into some new territory of grief that had no name and no release. That night, while she packed her belongings into suitcases that would travel to a penthouse downtown, while she prepared to slide into a life of luxury with a man whose greatest hardship was choosing between the Mercedes and the Tesla, he made a decision. He wouldn't fall apart. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of destroying him completely. She'd taken his legs, his love, his faith in permanence, but she wouldn't take his will to survive. In the darkness of the rehabilitation facility, surrounded by other broken people fighting their way back to some version of normal, he began planning his resurrection. Not for her. Not to win her back. But to prove that he was more than the sum of his injuries, more than the man she'd left behind. His comeback would be spectacular. The business conference was his idea of hell. Crowds, small talk, forced networking, everything his introverted nature despised. But his company had grown large enough to attract investor attention, and his CFO had insisted that he needed to show face in the industry. So here he stood in an overpriced hotel ballroom, nursing a drink he didn't want, making conversation he didn't enjoy, playing a role that still felt foreign despite his success. He saw her before she saw him. She stood near the bar, wearing a dress that probably cost more than his first month's revenue, laughing at something a silver-haired man was saying. The man had his hand on her lower back, possessive, proprietary. Jonathan. Presumably. The wealthy entrepreneur she'd left him for. In person, he looked older than expected, his success worn like expensive cologne, obvious and slightly overwhelming. She turned, and their eyes met across the crowded room. He watched the recognition hit her, watched her face cycle through shock, confusion, disbelief. Her gaze traveled down his body, pausing where legs should have been motionless, where a wheelchair should have been. He stood on his own 2 feet, straight and strong, wearing a custom suit that his success had purchased, looking nothing like the broken man she'd abandoned. She said something to Jonathan and started toward him. He considered walking away but decided against it. He'd spent 3 years rebuilding himself. He could handle 5 minutes of conversation with his ex-wife. "Hi," she said when she reached him, her voice uncertain. I didn't expect to see you here." I could say the same. He kept his tone neutral, professional. "How have you been?" "Good. Fine. She gestured vaguely back toward Jonathan. "We're engaged. Getting married next month." She paused, still staring at his legs like they might disappear if she blinked. "You're walking." "I am." "But the doctors said." "The doctors said a lot of things. I decided not to listen." He took a sip of his drink, letting her process. "Congratulations on the engagement, by the way. I hope you'll be very happy." She flinched at the civility, perhaps expecting anger or bitterness. "What are you doing here?" "At a business conference. I run a company. We're expanding, looking at investment opportunities. My CFO thought I should attend." He said it casually, not bothering to mention that his company's valuation had hit 8 figures, that he'd built an empire from a hospital bed and a laptop. Let her wonder. Jonathan appeared at her elbow, all polished charm and expensive dentistry. "Darling, who's your friend?" "This is," she faltered, "my ex-husband." Something flickered in Jonathan's eyes, recognition perhaps. The accident. Terrible business. He extended his hand. "Jonathan Whitmore. I've heard a great deal about you." "I'm sure you have." He shook the offered hand, noting the Rolex, the pinky ring, all the markers of wealth worn like armor. Nice to meet you. They made awkward small talk, the kind of stilted conversation that happens when past and present collide in uncomfortable proximity. He learned that Jonathan owned a real estate development company, that they'd expanded aggressively during the boom, that success had come easily and abundantly. He volunteered little about himself, deflecting questions with vague responses. Let them underestimate him. Let them assume he was scraping by on disability payments and sympathy. What he didn't know, what he'd learn only later, was that Jonathan's empire was built on leverage and optimism, on loans that assumed perpetual growth, on a foundation of cards that looked solid until the wind changed direction. The market was already shifting. Interest rates were climbing. The commercial real estate sector was beginning its slow-motion collapse. They parted with promises to stay in touch that none of them meant. He watched them walk away, her hand in Jonathan's, her laughter just a little too loud, a little too insistent. She glanced back once, her expression unreadable. The months that followed brought news through the grapevine, through mutual acquaintances and industry publications. Jonathan's company was struggling. Over-leveraged properties, underwater mortgages, investors demanding returns that couldn't be delivered. The silver-haired man who'd represented stability and success was watching his empire crumble in real time. Then came the wedding cancellation. According to social media whispers and deleted posts, she'd called it off. When your fiancé goes from billionaire to bankruptcy, apparently love becomes negotiable. He felt no satisfaction in this, only a weary recognition that she'd always been exactly who she was, someone who measured worth in security and comfort, who'd trade permanence for prosperity without hesitation. Jonathan's fall was spectacular and public. Foreclosures, lawsuits, a bankruptcy filing that made regional news. The man who'd had everything lost it with the same speed he'd acquired it. Real estate, cars, the penthouse, all of it seized by creditors and banks. He ended up in a modest rental, facing a future of rebuilding from rubble, learning the hard way that wealth and worth are not synonyms. 18 months after that conference, he received an unexpected call. A mutual acquaintance explained the situation. Jonathan had been trying to restart, to build something new, but doors kept closing. No one wanted to invest in a man with bankruptcy in his recent past. He needed capital, expertise, a chance to prove he could succeed again. Would he consider meeting with Jonathan? Not for her sake, she was long gone, moved on to someone else, but because everyone deserved a second chance. He should have said no. Every rational bone in his body argued against it. This was the man who'd benefited from his tragedy, who'd taken his wife while he was at his lowest, who'd represented everything he'd lost. But he'd learned something during his own resurrection. Life is long, circumstances change, and holding on to bitterness is exhausting. He agreed to the meeting. The coffee shop was deliberately neutral territory, not too nice, not too shabby, the kind of place where difficult conversations happened over overpriced lattes. Jonathan arrived first, and the change was startling. Gone was the polish, the expensive wardrobe, the air of untouchable success. The man who sat across from him looked tired, humbled, worn down by the kind of loss that strips away everything superficial and leaves only the core. "Thank you for meeting me," Jonathan said, his voice lacking its former confidence. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't." He stirred his coffee, watching the cream swirl into patterns. "Give me one good reason why I should help you." "I can't." Jonathan laughed bitterly. "There's no good reason. You owe me nothing. If anything, I owe you an apology that can never be adequate. I took advantage of your worst moment. I swept in like some kind of savior when really, I was just another opportunist. I knew what she'd left behind. I knew the circumstances. I should have told her to go back to you, to honor her commitments. Instead, he shook his head. I saw something I wanted and took it. That's who I was. Losing everything has a way of providing perspective." Jonathan met his eyes directly. "I'm not asking for charity. I have a business plan, a solid strategy for a new venture. I've learned from my mistakes. I over-leveraged, grew too fast, believed my own hype. This time would be different. Sustainable, conservative, built on actual value rather than inflated projections. But no one will give me the chance to prove it. Every door I knock on, My bankruptcy follows me in. And you think I'll be different? No. I think you'd be completely justified in telling me to go to hell. I think you'd have every right to enjoy watching me struggle the way you struggled. But I'm asking anyway, because I'm out of options and out of pride. He slid a folder across the table. That's the business plan. Look it over. If you think it's garbage, walk away. If you think there's potential but you can't stomach working with me, I understand. I'm just asking for a fair evaluation. He opened the folder, scanning the contents. Despite himself, he was impressed. Jonathan had clearly learned from his failures. The plan was conservative, realistic, focused on niche markets rather than explosive growth. The financial projections were modest but sustainable. It was actually good, the kind of venture that could succeed with proper funding and patient management. Why real estate again? He asked. Why not start fresh in a different industry? Because it's what I know. I failed at it, but I failed at the business side, not the fundamental work. I still understand the market, still have the relationships, still know how to find value in properties others overlook. I just need to do it smarter this time. Jonathan paused. And because starting over in something completely new feels like running away. I want to succeed in the same arena where I failed. I want to prove I learned something. They talked for 2 hours. He asked hard questions and got honest answers. Jonathan didn't make excuses or blame external circumstances. He owned his mistakes, acknowledged his character flaws, spoke with the clarity that only comes from losing everything and surviving it. This wasn't the arrogant man from the conference. This was someone who'd been broken and was rebuilding himself piece by piece, a journey he understood intimately. Finally, he closed the folder. I'll fund it. 60% equity for me, 40% for you. You run operations, but major decisions go through me. Any sign you're reverting to old habits, I pull my investment. This is a one-time offer. Mess it up, and we're done forever. Jonathan's eyes widened. You're serious? Completely. But I need you to understand something. He leaned forward. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I remember what it felt like when everyone counted me out, when the world decided I was finished. Someone gave me a chance. Actually, I gave myself a chance, but I had people along the way who didn't slam doors in my face. I'm paying that forward. But make no mistake, if you waste this opportunity, I'll shut you down without hesitation. I won't. Jonathan's voice shook slightly. I swear to you, I won't. The business launched 6 months later. True to his word, Jonathan approached it with humility and discipline. They started small, focusing on undervalued commercial properties in emerging neighborhoods, adding value through strategic improvements rather than speculative flipping. Growth was slow but steady, profits modest but real. He remained involved, attending quarterly meetings, reviewing financials, offering guidance when asked. It was strange, this partnership with a man who'd once represented everything he'd lost. But somewhere along the way, the strangeness faded into something resembling respect. 2 years into the venture, Jonathan insisted on meeting for dinner. They chose the same coffee shop where it had all begun, a deliberate callback to that first conversation. I've been thinking, Jonathan said after they'd ordered, about how to repay you. Not the money, the company's profitable now, and you're getting your returns. But the chance you gave me. The faith you showed when nobody else would. You don't owe me anything beyond our business agreement. I disagree. You gave me something nobody else would, not redemption, because that's something I have to earn myself, but opportunity. The chance to prove I could be better than my worst moments. Jonathan paused. I ran into her last month. Your ex-wife. She asked about you. And I told her you were doing well. That you'd built an incredible company. That you'd walked away from everything she did to you and built something remarkable. She asked if you were happy. Jonathan smiled slightly. I said I didn't know, but I hoped so, because you deserved it more than anyone I'd ever met. He considered the question. Was he happy? Not in the simple, uncomplicated way happiness is portrayed in movies. But he was content. proud of what he'd built, satisfied with who he'd become, at peace with the scars that would always mark him. The accident had broken his body, a betrayal had broken his heart, but he'd reassembled himself into something stronger, more resilient, more authentically himself. "I'm getting there," he said finally. "Some days are harder than others. But I wake up grateful to be alive, grateful I can walk, grateful for the work I do. That's more than a lot of people can say. It's more than I could say for a long time." Jonathan raised his glass. To second chances. And to the people gracious enough to offer them. They drank to that. Two men who'd started as adversaries, ended up as partners, and found something approaching friendship in the complicated space between. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to their small drama. But in that moment, in that coffee shop where difficult conversations became unlikely partnerships, they created something worth celebrating. Proof that people could change, that grace could triumph over bitterness, that the worst moments didn't have to define the rest of the story. He'd started this journey in darkness, broken and abandoned, with nothing but rage and determination. He'd clawed his way back to standing, built an empire from a hospital bed, learned to walk when doctors said it was impossible. And now, on the other side of all that struggle, he discovered the final piece of his healing, the ability to offer someone else the same second chance he'd given himself. Not for her, who'd moved on to yet another relationship, still searching for something she'd never find in other people because she'd never looked for it in herself. Not even really for Jonathan, though he'd benefited enormously. But for himself, because holding on to bitterness would have been another kind of paralysis, another way of staying broken. The steel beam that had crushed his spine 3 years ago had taught him many things. It had shown him who people really were when things got hard. It had revealed his own strength, his capacity for endurance, his ability to rebuild from absolute devastation. But most importantly, it had taught him that life's greatest victories aren't about revenge or vindication or proving something to people who've already proven they don't matter. They're about becoming the person you needed when you were at your lowest point. About offering grace not because someone deserves it, but because holding on to anger is exhausting and forgiveness, real forgiveness, is the ultimate freedom. He'd saved her life and lost his legs. She'd abandoned him and lost her integrity. Jonathan had taken advantage and lost his empire. But somehow, impossibly, all of them had been given the chance to be better than their worst moments. Only some of them had taken it.